Alright, in this video we're going to see kind of what happens after the American Revolution. So now that they've declared peace and they're independent, now what? How did the war affect Americans? So first off, the money. War always comes down to money. So the U.S. was severely in debt, and so the U.S. needs to pay their soldiers, both the U.S. soldiers, as well as the French soldiers that helped to fight for them, as well as their weapons suppliers in France. So they bought a whole bunch of weapons, they just haven't paid for them yet, so they are in serious debt. One way that they paid off the American soldiers was they would just print off extra money. And so they made their continental bucks. And this led to a whole lot of nasty inflation. So they just kept printing more money. They didn't understand basic economics. And this led to a depression in the 1780s. So the economy starts off very, very poorly. By the end of this war, they are $81 million in debt. $12 million they owe to themselves, so that's what they owe to the soldiers and anybody else that they bought from. So $12 million to soldiers, $44 million to foreign countries, including Spain, France especially, as well as the Dutch. They owe $44 million. And then $25 million to the states. So if the states were letting them borrow certain things, or if the states bought guns, then the federal government now needs to repay the states. And so we start in a bit of debt. And so here's our debt as a percentage of GDP. So kind of right off the bat, we're at a pretty bad start. And you can see this chart. Every time there's a war, we can see this little change in debt. Where, War of 1812, we had a spike in debt. And here we have Civil War, spike in debt right here. World War I, there's some debt there. World War II, whole lot of debt. And things feel a little better, we don't spend too much money over here. In Vietnam, we don't spend very much money on Vietnam, not much debt there. Part of the reason why we lose there. And then we see Cold War, we spend a whole bunch of money to win the Cold War. And then here we have Iraq and Afghanistan, a little bit of the recession here. So you can see these peaks and valleys according to what wars and how we're spending our money. Trade. We lose our top trade partner. UK is a little angry at us, so we're going to take a break. And so during the war, we lose our top trade partner, so we don't have anybody to sell our stuff to. We're going to lose money that way. So we're producing a whole bunch of rice, indigo, and tobacco. Usually we would sell that to England, but in this case we had nobody to sell it to, so it just piled up. After the war, we lost those really great deals we had in the past, and that we, as part of the British Empire, we would get better deals. And now we are treated as a foreign country, and so this would lead to actually increased taxes. As a different country, we get tariffs, so taxes be placed on a different country. And so the price of British beef, the price of sugar doubles. And so prices go up and taxes go up. So keep in mind, this war wasn't necessarily about taxes, it's about representation. Because in the end, our taxes go up and our trade does not get better when it comes to England. So we need to find new trade partners. So here we see inflation kind of going back and forth over time. On the outside, trade can get better in some ways, in that mercantilism's over. We can trade with whoever we want. And so even though trade with England decreases, our trade with France and Spain increases manyfold. And so the U.S. becomes the first to trade with Spanish America, which causes some tension with Spain. So we see the opportunity to start to trade with countries like Mexico, even though Mexico is still part of Spain. And so this does annoy Spain, and they start to get a little nervous, saying, well, if the Americans went for independence, what's going to happen with Mexico? Are they going to go for independence? And why are those two talking behind my back? So they're a little nervous. Plus, we had no navy. We had a couple ships here and there, but if there were pirates in the Caribbean, or if there were English pirates that wanted to just steal our stuff, we didn't really have a navy to fight those pirates, so we were really open to attacks on the open seas. On the upside, no restrictions on production, so we can build as much as we want. In the past, we weren't allowed to sell certain things like hats. We weren't allowed to sell hats. Now we can build as much as we want, and there's no king to stop us. So the economy does expand in other ways. And so if we were just looking at English trade, yeah, we weaken there. But we're growing in many other ways, so in the big picture, it's getting better. Proclamation of 1763 is over. So it used to be we would be stuck in these 13 colonies. That's done. And so now we can move into all this territory. And so farmers start to move into this new territory to get that good land. Because most of the good land of 13 colonies at this point was already taken. So now all these settlers can cross over the mountains to settle into Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and moving into the Indiana Territory, into Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so they're quickly moving in, grabbing up this good land. As far as social status, and so did a lot of things change as far as who's in charge, who's rich, who's poor? No, not really. The rich white guys in charge were still the rich white guys in charge afterwards. And so the war is about political equality, not necessarily economic equality. George Washington was the richest guy before the war, and he's the richest guy after the war. And so the poor were fighting as soldiers, but their situation didn't really get better. They were still poor at the end of the war. And so economic equality doesn't really move much. Loyalists. The Loyalists, they lose their top rank, and that because they were loyal to the king, a lot of them lose that. King's out. And so if they were owed any debts, they don't get paid off their debts. In many cases, if they were scared and they ran away and left their homes, in most cases, they weren't allowed to come back home. And their homes were taken by the government and sold to help pay off American debts. 100,000 of these loyalists, they're going to run away to Canada after the war. And so largely they're going to move into these yellow areas and basically form the Canadian population. Half of them were leaving for political reasons, and that they lost their political jobs. They might have those political opportunities in Canada, where they're still part of the empire. And half left for economic opportunity, and that they're not going to be able to trade with these patriots remembering what happened, or their businesses were destroyed, their homes were sold off to pay off American debts. So the Loyalists did not get a very good deal in this case. If you were higher level in the army, you did get better. If you were Congress, or if you were an officer in the army, now you're kind of you're the top status. Without royalty, you are the top now. And so the officers become the upper class. And so they form their own little fancy society, the Society of the Cincinnati, which is based on that old Roman soldier that was able to fight very, very well. And then when he was done fighting, he went back to and was a farmer. And then, so it's the whole idea of these guys are kind of putting their swords down, and now they can become farmers. And they do start to place limits on the poor, and so these guys, they were basically forming the American upper class. As far as farmers, taxes got worse once they became American. Taxes were increased to pay off that massive debt for the war. And so a lot of the farmers couldn't pay their taxes. And so they would face foreclosure due to this extreme debt that they would have. So because they couldn't pay their taxes, they would take out loans, and a lot of these loans, they would be called up by the bank and they'd lose everything. As far as women, not much better. As far as African Americans, slavery's going to get stronger. As far as Native Americans, it's going to get worse. And so for a lot of groups, not much is changing, unless you were part of the upper class before and you were patriotic. And the upper class loyalists are out. So speaking of these angry farmers that are going into debt, eventually it gets to a pretty extreme. And so back in Massachusetts, we get Shays' Rebellion, led by a farmer, Daniel Shays. And all these farmers, they keep ending up in court, where the court says, hey, if you can't pay off your debt, we're going to take your farm, sell your farm, and you're going to pay off your debts that way. So all these people keep losing their farms in Massachusetts. And so all the farmers start to rise up and form another revolution, just 3 years later after the other one's done. Rich people in Massachusetts at this point hire an army to stop the rebellion, because there really wasn't an American army at that point. Everybody went back home. We didn't have a standing army. The rebels are all pardoned by Washington, and most of these guys were veterans that are pretty angry because they got a bad deal. State law then changes to help protect these farmers. But with this rebellion, this shows Congress that they need change. The Articles of Confederation were too weak to control internal dissent. The people weren't happy. We needed a new government. And so this becomes the inspiration to meet again to write the new Constitution. Social status continued. Yeah, the soldiers didn't really see an improvement in their status. They went and fought, hoping to create a better country for themselves. And they did a little bit, but not much for themselves. They were not paid the pensions or retirement they were promised. So they were promised a basic retirement package. Most of them didn't get that. They didn't get much in social mobility. They hoped that by serving their country, maybe they can move up in status from poor, maybe up to middle class. Nope. And because they don't get paid, they don't really move up in status. And so most of these guys, they're just going to move west, hoping to start up a farm and find status, find wealth out west. But serving in the military didn't do it. As far as Native American tribes, it didn't get better. It got worse. During the peace talks in Paris, Native Americans were not invited, nor even thought of. They were seen as savages not deserving human rights. And so the war continued. Even though the war against the English stops in 83, the war against these tribes continues for another 12 years of fighting. And so we do keep part of our army, led by General Mad Anthony Wayne, to continue fighting any loyalist tribes one by one. These tribes do not unite. They are picked off one by one. As they are taken out, all their land is taken, and they are forced to just move west, move west. This is why you don't see much native land on the East Coast. It's all taken in the 1790s as a result of this. A lot of tribes will split and try to negotiate for whatever they can, but the Americans are not very forgiving, and most of that land is gone. And that's a little look at kind of what happens after the war.